Move to debate on Part 2. The question is at Part 2, stand part. This is debate on clauses 58 to 146B and Schedules 1A to 3A. The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Chairman, I rise to convey Labour's support for this part of the bill, and in doing so, sir, wish to tender an apology to you and to the House. Sir, in my initial remarks on Part 1, I made the misplaced comment that Part 1 was the most major part of the bill, and I see on closer examination that Part 2 is equally substantive and important, amending as it does very significantly the Public Finance Act. Mr Speaker, the bill proposes a number of amendments to the Public Finance Act, and principally the following. Firstly, the establishment of a new appropriation type to be called a multi-category appropriation, or MCA. And the purpose of this is to allow different types of expenditure to be grouped into a single appropriation where they support a single policy objective or overarching purpose. And so this is one of the principal innovations in this Act in the way that the design of the government's machinery is carried out, and it calls us to reflect on the nature of what we're doing here today. This is not just tinkering legislation. This is framework legislation, and that's why it's good that it's bipartisan across the House, that governs the major rules and regulations by which the organs of the state operate. So that is everything from the rules upon which they are structured, principally delivered through the State Sector Act reforms in Part 1, and of course the rules by which their finances are governed, which is dealt with in this part, Part 2, as amendments to the Public Finance Act. And sir, members of the public will recall, and members opposite will hopefully recall, that the Public Finance Act is a very extensive piece of legislation which contains the provisions for fiscal accountability, the ability for Parliament and the public to be able to trace subventions or appropriations from year to year, to be able to track the movement of public funds, and to give effect to that age-old tenet of our inherited constitution that there's no taxation without representation. And this is where the rubber, as it were, meets the road, because it is through the legal framework set out in the Public Finance Act as amended by this bill that we get the rules about accountability. Now, the main point here is to allow a new form of accountability, multi-category appropriations, which allow policy purposes to be driven simultaneously through several different agencies or votes. Now, in the past, what's had to happen under the rules of public finance is a lead agency has been designated, they've borne the financial responsibility, but through that they've also maintained primary control through the cabinet process. And that has not, I think it's fair to say, on both sides of the House that have sat in the Treasury benches over the years would agree, that hasn't always favoured the highest possible level of cooperation between the agencies of the state. So what we're doing here is we are plumbing into the financial reporting rules a whole new beast. It's a beast called a multi-category appropriation, and it is based on the presumption that the behaviour will follow the money, and if the money's in a common pot where several different agencies have to draw from it, then we're more likely to get truly unified behaviour. And the Labour opposition agrees with the government that it is a good thing to have that type of provision available, provided that there are sufficient controls around it. And I'm pleased to say that following the amendments put in place by the Select Committee, it's now our view that those controls do exist. And as our colleagues have said in relation to Part 1, for the Labour opposition, this is a relatively unusual bill, an unusual process. We quite strongly opposed the bill at first reading. There were a number of provisions in it, quite a lot of them in Part 1, that we very trenchantly opposed. We're very pleased that through the negotiation process in the Select Committee there have been an extensive range of amendments, and we can now support it. The amendments here have been around two principal aspects of multi-category appropriations. Firstly, requirements for full and complete traceability down to the sub-output class level. That's a very granular approach so that Parliament, members of Parliament can trace, and the public can trace changes in public expenditure through the years and across categories, and that's particularly important where a multi-category appropriation has the potential to blend prior year appropriations that came from different departments. Too easy to do smoke and mirrors without the amendments made to this Act. Mr. Chairman.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Chairman, it follows that it is made clear in the amendments that other departments, as well as the one administering an appropriation, can incur expenses against that appropriation. It's the second principle, if we like, that follows from the MCA principle. And the idea there is that where there are a group of agencies cooperating towards a policy outcome, they can incur expenses against a single appropriation if that's appropriate, and that again plumbs into the operations, the machinery of government, cooperative behaviour at every level. The information required in the estimates and supporting information is being changed to focus more closely on the policy intent of what is being achieved within each organisation. We talked about this in Part 1, the shift from simple output monitoring to outcome monitoring, that is measuring the work that the state does against the question, why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? How are we trying to achieve it follows. As we said in Part 1, the risk with that is that if we lose sight of the output measures completely, sometimes outcome reporting can be a bit vague, but a proper combination of the two has been shown to deliver the best balance in terms of strategic thinking and specific behaviour tracking. Mr. Chairman, the provisions allow annual reports of more than one department to be presented together in one document where this would more meaningfully convey information. So there's a third significant change, as well as multi-category appropriations and multiple departments drawing upon a single appropriation. Now we can have multiple departments reporting through one accountability document that applies to a particular program. And again, we are designing into the machinery of government the ability to require cooperation of our agencies from the ground up. We are standardising the governance and performance reporting requirements for companies that are listed in Schedule 4 of the Public Finance Act. That's companies where there is an element, or a substantial element of Crown ownership. And as I look through the bill, and I will be picking this up, Mr. Chairman, in my next call, I will go clause by clause through some of these key changes, because there are 60 pages of amendments, sir. And let me draw the attention of the House to one particular matter which I think is pretty important, which is around clause 59B and 3AB, which appears on page 65 of SOP 262 as represented. Sir, that is where Ministers of the Crown hold on behalf of the Crown more than 50% of the issued ordinary shares in the capital of a company. Now, I do think it's necessary to put on record, sir, that this is not a provision that applies to the government's harebrained partial privatisation scheme. This is about the development of mixed ownership entities that are other than the privatisation scheme that we've heard so much about in the media of the energy companies. And the reason for making that clear, sir, is because there are a number of strategic disadvantages with the partial privatisation program the government's currently engaged on that include the loss of strategic control to the portfolio, having to have regard in law to minority shareholders' rights, the loss of the controls normally contained in the State-Owned Enterprise Act, including the no surprises policy and the power to direct, and the loss of dividend flows, which mean that the program is often cash value negative. Mr. Speaker, I'll come on to it in subsequent calls, but there are a large number of schedules, Schedule 1A, Schedule 2, Schedule 3 and Schedule 3A, that apply to the Public Finance Act and pertain to amendments in this part, and we'll be touching on some of them across the debate on this part. And there are a number of SOPs, sir, that contain measures in Part 2 that we'll want to touch in this debate. So, sir, we could be, I think, with your leave, sir, here for quite a long time going through this. SOP number 168 from Minister Coleman bears upon the Public Finance Act, SOP 262, which is very extensive from the Minister, bears upon it. We've disposed already of 259 and 265. 261 also has some provisions. And so let me note two things on the SOPs here as an introductory comment. The first, sir, is that it is somewhat disappointing, Mr Chairman.
Dr David Clark.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. As I begin my call, I'll just request that Mr Cunliffe give me my notes, which